Okay, good morning. We are on Tzadi Amud Aleph 90A1. I think, so let's do the math, but I think we might be finishing during the 9 days, which is kind of exciting. We'll see. I'm very anti people making siyumim during the 9 days, just waiting things out to make a siyum. But if you literally finish and you finished Eruvin, then you deserve to make a siyum. That would be a siyum that I would participate in and I would eat in. I think that's a fair implication, right? So if we do finish, someone do the math for me. We're 30 days out, which should put us July 22nd. I think is that Rosh Chodesh Av? I need to check. Maybe, no, it might be right before. Okay, might be right before. Okay, we'll see. Okay, anyway, we definitely deserve a siyum. Okay, let's go. Here we are. So, Tzadi Amud Aleph 90A1, right at the top of the page. So, Bayi Rami Bar Chama. Okay, so Rami Bar Chama asked the following question: Shtei amos begag. Let's say, are you allowed to carry something 2 amos on a roof, ushtei amos be'amud, and then from there to 2 amos on a post, which is 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide, which is typically seen as a private domain. Mahu, is this allowed? Okay, so what is the question? If you recall, we've been discussing rooftops, and we've been discussing the fact that a person is not allowed to carry according to the Chacham, a person is not allowed to carry from one rooftop to another unless there is an Eruv, right? So in other words, that was clear. If there is 2 rooftops, a person is not allowed to carry. Rameir said that all the outdoor spaces, a person is allowed to go from one rooftop to another rooftop, but the Chachamim said no, each rooftop you're not allowed to go from one person's rooftop to another person's rooftop on Shabbos, okay? But the question is, what about going from one rooftop, okay, to what is considered a private domain away from the rooftop? So basically what you have is as follows. You have a rooftop, this is the guy's rooftop, just a bird's eye view, rooftop, person's over here. Now, you're not allowed to carry more than 4 amos, there's no Eruvin, but let's say you have a post over here, okay, which is, 4 by 10, okay, 4 by 10. So there's a private domain. The rooftop over here technically is seen, it's really a private domain, but in some ways we treat it like a Carmelist in the sense that it is it's something where the Chachamim said you're not allowed to be going from rooftop to rooftop, right? Because the fact that they don't have a Eruvin. So we'll treat this in some respects like a Carmelist. You with me? In other words, a Carmelist is a place where you are not allowed, the Chum said, right? Rameir said, you're allowed to be jumping from rooftop to rooftop, etc. Rameir said, no problem. They're all outside, they're all outdoors, they're all private domains. You're allowed to go from one place to another. Chum said, no, you can't go from one private domain to another, and therefore what do we treat it like? We treat it effectively like a Carmelist. A Carmelist is basically our public domain where you're only allowed to carry something within 4 amos. You're not allowed to go beyond that, okay? So over here, we're treating this effectively like a Carmelist, yeah? And the question is, you're only allowed to carry 4 amos. But so if I was on my rooftop, I'm allowed to go 4 amos over here, no problem. Within this 4 amos space, I'm allowed to go. But the question is, am I allowed to go 2 amos over here, and then I guess I'll jump over, and 2 amos over there? Would that be allowed? That's Rami Bar Chama's question. Yeah? Okay? Now the Gemara pushes back. The Gemara says, Amar Rabba, Mike mi baile. What question is this? Carmelist or Shusiyachli my baile? Ultimately, what he's asking is, are you allowed to carry from a Carmelist to a private domain? You're certainly not allowed to do that. In other words, when this whole halacha of going from one domain to another, where a mayor and the Chum disagree, is you're going from within Carmelist to Carmelist to Carmelist. But going from Carmelist to Rosh Yachid, which is what that post is, that pillar is, that certainly is going from one type of domain to another. There's no way that's going to be allowed. So the Gemara says you're right. V'rami bar Chama agav chorfe. Yeah.
So why would you think that you should be able to? Because they're the same. They're not even. Yesterday we were talking where they were.
So let's see what the question ultimately is. The Gemara is ultimately asking a question. What are you talking about? So let's see what the real question is, and I think hopefully that'll clarify. So Rami Bar Chama, agav chorfe lo ayin be, because of his quickness of his mind, did not clarify his question. Okay, Rami Bar Chama was apparently very quick, and therefore sometimes he would just blurt it out. There was more to say, but he didn't really spell it out. This is what he was really asking. Shtei amos begag ushtei amos b'chsadra mahu. What is the halacha regarding carrying 2 amos on a roof? Okay, which is a Carmelist, and 2 amos on, I know they have over here the roof of a portico, but there's different ways of understanding a portico is essentially an outdoor space, which is, it's like this. The way that some understand this is that it's an outdoor space which is roofed in, so imagine like an outdoor gazebo with a roof, but if the roof is flat, then we have a concept that the edges of the walls are considered as if they go down, right? That was one of the halachos we saw earlier, if you have a flat roof. But if you have a slanted roof, that halacha does not apply, okay? So this portico over here, it has a slanted slanted roof. Okay, so I don't know. You imagine like these outdoor spaces, which are, you go to the park sometimes. They have these like places which are, they have a roof like this, a slanted roof, but and they cover some space. That would be considered a carmelis. That's also considered a carmelis because it's not. If it was a flat roof, then it would be considered like it's walled in. It would be considered a private domain. But it does not have a flat roof, and therefore, what we're asking is going from a rooftop to such a place. Now, back to Max's question. What is the question? What's going on over here? So, meaning the Chachamim said, you can't go from one roof to another. Why would you be allowed to go from a roof to a portico, to this outdoor gazebo type thing? So the Gemara says like this, Mi amrinan kevan to lo have hai chazi ladira, v'lo hai chazi ladira chadi reshusi. Do we say that since people are not living on the roof, and people are not living on the portico. Therefore, we say that we treat it as if it's one place. We treat it as if it's one place. Or do we say that since a person is not allowed to go from one roof to another, according to the Chachamim, migaglach sadra nami aser. Therefore, it's also going to be prohibited to go from one roof to a portico. The question is as follows, meaning like this: when the Chachamim come along and say you can't go from one roof to another, Rameir's position in some ways is more understandable. Again, jumping from one roof to another, Rameir says no problem. Why is it allowed? He says at the end of the day, people are not living. It's not like you're going from a private, like a courtyard to a courtyard. People are not living on these roofs, right? And basically, it's all just Carmelis. It's all just consistent Carmelis, right? Ultimately, this is the domain name for this is Carmelis. Even though there's a person living underneath, at the end of the day, it's just a classic Carmelis. You're allowed to normally go within Carmelis, walking around within the well, I shouldn't call it Carmelis.
How far apart are they?
Enough that you could jump there, whatever. The point is that they're all essentially private. They're all private domains. They're not considered a place. People are not living there. Sorry?
Carmelis not a private.
Carmelis not private domain. Sorry, let me retract. The point is that this is a place where a person is not living. And therefore, a mayor says, okay, so at the end of the day, they have the proper walls, right? These are considered like it's walled in on each one. And you're going to another one, you're going to another one. At the end of the day, it's not like you're going from one private domain to a private domain to a private domain. It's basically a place where people are not typically living here. I'm allowed to go from one to another. The Chum say, at the end of the day, since people live under here, people living in the house underneath each of these things, therefore, they're really seen as distinct domains, and therefore I'm not allowed to go from one to another. When it comes to an achsadra, when it comes to this portico, since no one is actually living in that space, maybe the Chacham say that prohibition of going from here to here would not apply over here. Because why do they say you can't go from here to here? Because at the end of the day, there are different residences underneath. But if I'm going from a place where there's a residence to a place where there's no residence, maybe that decree will not apply. And therefore, that's the question of here to here, the Chacham say absolutely not, okay? But here to a achsadra, here to a portico where no one is living, there we don't have to be as concerned if people are going from one distinctly separate place to another, and maybe therefore the Chacham would say it's going to be allowed. That's the question. Ultimately, there's a small difference, and therefore maybe it's going to be allowed. Yeah?
We spoke I don't know, a long time ago about a structure where you have just a certain number of walls and a roof, but there's nothing, but it was covered on top.
Right.
And the point was underneath. Now
right.
We're focusing on that you have this gazebo type place, but the focus is what's above it. And since no one's using it and it's not lived in, then it doesn't really.
Well, the focus over here is underneath as well, meaning you're going from the rooftop to the achsadra underneath.
But I thought we've established in those that whether you needed to have towards a peta, whether it counted, whether you had to do different things to have. I don't remember all the specifics, but it seems like there was a need back then for an Eruvin in some capacity, where here you don't.
So again, we're not talking about carrying fully. We're talking about carrying 4 amos, meaning we're saying, right, I'm not allowed to carry. Everyone's going to agree I'm not allowed to carry in this space, which is. The question is, do we see this as one, meaning again, the Chacham come along and say, within one private domain, within one rooftop, I'm allowed to only carry 4 amos. I'm only allowed to carry 4 amos. If it's opened up to other ones, I'm only allowed to carry within 4 amos, okay? But over here, 2 and 2, I'm not allowed to do. So why? Because they're distinct, right? Again, so let's just go back. Right, sorry?
I was just thinking this was the same thing.
So let's take a step back. Let's review. Okay, bottom line is you have these rooftops, right? The person's able to go from one to another, and the Chachamim said, I'm only allowed to go within one rooftop, a distance of 4 amos. I cannot go 2 amos on one rooftop, 2 amos on another rooftop, even though they're really technically the same space. Why did they say that? They said that because at the end of the day, there are different residences in each, and therefore they said, no, we have to see them as completely distinct. You cannot carry 2 over here, 2 over there. The question is, when one of them is not a residence, when one of them is not even like a quasi-residence, it's just this place where people go and barbecue, whatever, and therefore, are you allowed to go 2 over here, 2 over there? That is the question. Okay? Says the Gemara further. Bai Rabibi Barabai, Shtei Amos Begag, Shtei Amos Berachur V'Mahu. What's the halacha of going 2 amos on a roof and 2 amos into someone else's ruin? Now, ruins, if you remember, is a little bit funny because when we think of ruin, we think like, obviously no one's living there. But as we pointed out, and we know there are examples here in Baltimore, and that is that people oftentimes do live in ruins. It's not the best real estate, but at the end of the day, people do live in dilapidated, broken places. It's just not as ideal of a living space, but it is a quasi-living space. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Keep that in mind. Okay, so Amar of Kahana. So the Gemara assumes at this point, Rav Kahana says, "Lav Hana Rama bar Chama." He says, "Is this not the same question as Rama bar Chama?" At the end of the day, you're going from a roof. Okay, I already killed some of the answer to the question, but the point is that initially the question, they thought the question was no different than going from a rooftop to the portico. That's basically the same thing. Is the Gemara says, aren't you asking the same question? So Amar Bibi Barabaya, am I really coming to ask someone else's question? He says, no. He says the difference is, I already told you, and that is the roof of the portico, is not fit for living at all. No one lives in a gazebo. Whereas a ruin, is potentially fit for living in. So says the Gemara, now if it's a full-fledged home, then what's the question? In other words, if 2 rooftops, we said you can't go from one rooftop to another because they're both residences. So now you're telling me, a chorva, a ruin, is a place where people live. Then obviously you can't do it. In as much as you can't go from one rooftop to another rooftop, you certainly are not to go from a rooftop to ruins. So the Gemara says no. Imtim to lomar ka'amar. What he's asking is if you're going to say, meaning like this, 98.2. Imtim to lomar chsadra lo chazul jira. Even if you assume, remember, the Gemara asked the question regarding the portico. We did not answer the question, right? It was a question. The Gemara said, are you allowed to go from a rooftop to the portico? And the Gemara left it unresolved. But now he's saying like this, Imtim Talomar, if you're going to say that you are allowed to go from a portico or from a rooftop to a portico to rooftop, why? Because the reason for that is because the portico is not fit for living whatsoever. And therefore, chorva chazladira. But whereas a ruin, you might not be allowed because it is fit for residence. And therefore, maybe it's aser. Or do we say that since now no one is living there, meaning at the end of the day, it's something which if a person wants, they could put some boards in the window, they could, close a few things up and live there, and therefore we'll treat it as a residence, and therefore it's not going to be allowed? Or do we say at the end of the day, since no one is living in it this second, and therefore, since no one's living there right now, therefore it would be permitted, the Gemara leaves it unresolved. Yeah? In other words, let's just review. Again, the Gemara asked the question before. Within one rooftop, everyone said, you're allowed to carry 4 amos. From one rooftop to another rooftop, the Chacham said you cannot do it because it's one residence and another residence. We had a question. Can I go from a rooftop to a portico? A portico is not livable. People don't live there, and therefore the Gemara asked that question. We weren't sure. According to one view, we said at the end of the day, they're both separate residences. The other view says, okay, but even though they're separate residences, no one's living in the portico, and porticos are not lived in, and therefore maybe it should be allowed. The Gemara left that unresolved. But now the Gemara is saying, according to the possibility that it should be allowed, because at the end of the day, it's not really 2 residences, even though it's owned by 2 people, at the end of the day, no one's living in the portico. How does that relate to a ruin? By a ruin, we could say on the one hand, it's more of a residence than a portico, because porticos no one ever lives in, and a ruin, sometimes people live in it when they fix it up a little bit, and therefore it should be like 2 rooftops. Or do we say at the end of the day, if no one is living in there now, even if it's owned by someone, but no one's living in there now, maybe that'd be enough of a reason to go from one to another, and the Gemara leaves that unresolved. Okay, fine.
Such an unsatisfying ending to it. Back and forth. Right? It was so built up.
Okay, I hear. The fair.
Because now, the question. So, if one were to be in this situation, what do you do?
Good question. So the Gemara, the post can point out that one of the Gemaras, I'm trying to remember if it's coming up or it's before, it does resolve this question. I don't know. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi in the meantime. But I'm not sure. Well, not this one, because I clearly don't have the answer for you. Okay.
Comes up next.
Okay. Good. Says the Gemara. Okay, let's go a little bit further. So Gagin Hashavin Rameir. Okay, let's say you have roofs which are the same level according to Rameir. The Gag, which again Rameir said, if they're all on the same level according to Rameir, what are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to go from one roof to another according to Rameir? Yes, Rameir said if all the roofs are the same height, you're allowed to go from one to another. The Gag Yichidi l'Rabanan, or a single roof according to the Chachamim, right? If it's an entire roof is one domain, and it's not open to other ones, right? You just have one single roof. Again, the Chachamim said you can't go from one roof to another, but if it's one rooftop, right, you're allowed to carry there. So there, if it's one rooftop, Rav Amar Mutter l'taltal bekulo. Rav says if it's one rooftop, then you're allowed to carry throughout the whole thing. Shmuel Amar bo ela ba'arba. Shmuel says no. In that case, you could only carry within 4 amos. Now, if you remember, that's exact opposite of their previous opinions. Remember, earlier, right? The Gemara says Rav Amar. Let's read it inside. Rav Amar mutzal taltal bekulo. Rav says that if it's one roof, you're allowed to carry the entire roof. Kasha de Rav de Rav. Earlier, Rav said that you're only allowed to carry 4 amos, 4 amos within one roof, and here he's saying you're allowed to carry through the whole roof. So the Gemara says no. Hasam lo minkara mechitzta. There, remember, Rav and Shmuel were talking about this case. This case where it's 2 adjoining roofs, which were side by side. Rav said in this case, you're only allowed to carry 4 amos. Shmuel said you're allowed to carry throughout this whole space. Okay? That was the earlier discussion. And now we have Rav saying, if it's one roof, I'm allowed to carry throughout the entire thing. And Shmuel saying I'm only allowed to carry 4 amos. So the Gemara says, hey, why are these not contradictory? So the Gemara says, well, very simple. Rav says, in this above case, Hasam Laminkara Mechitzta. Here, this wall, Rav is saying, you don't just see this wall. Right? In other words, it's true, this is blue and this is red, and it's 2 distinct properties. But at the end of the day, this wall, Rav said, since it's flush with the other wall, halachically, I don't see this wall as going up. And therefore, Rav said, it's 2 private spaces, open up one to another, they don't have an Eruv, I can't carry. Right? Mithri? Yeah? Basically, but over here, it's surrounded, there's 4 walls. Again, they're not walls, this is a building, right? I'm going to continue to pretend to show off over here, right? There is this building over here. There's no walls on top, right? This is the person's store, there's the windows. Okay, great, fantastic. We're getting more sophisticated. Sorry, this is terrible. Okay, bottom line is, this rooftop, right? Why is it, the walls are all the corners are all evident, and therefore we make a virtual wall going up, and it's basically treated like it has a virtual wall all around it, right? But that's why Rav says, in this case, I'm allowed to carry. In this case, I'm missing a wall. And that's why I'm not allowed to carry throughout the whole thing. Make sense? Yeah? That's why, right? So Rav says, this case, I'm allowed to carry the whole thing because it's ki'ilu, it's as if it's surrounded. This case, I can't because, yes, this wall is all virtual walls. This wall is not because he says it's flush the other one, therefore not allowed. Okay. Ushmuel Amar, Shmuel, no contradiction in Shmuel. Shmuel who said, in this case, you're allowed to carry. And in this case, you're not allowed to carry. Shmuel Amar Im Tatzim Bo'el Rab Amos Kasha to Shmuel. There's a contradiction within Shmuel. The Gemara says Hasam have a Yotzim Beis Asayim. In the roof area case, it's not more than 2 Beisa. Hacha v'Yotzim Beis Asayim. Okay, what is Beisa? Beisa is about 1,000. Different opinions. Basically, a little bit under 1,000 yards. So like this. In both cases, we're talking about the same exact area. Okay, we're talking about the same exact area. In both these cases, you have, let's say, 2,000 yards. Okay, 2,000 yards is a beisa. Typically, we treat that like a carmelis. Okay, when it's very, very large, we treat it like a carmelis. It's no longer seen as a private domain. In this case, although this whole area is 2,000, but since you have this virtual wall, according to Shmuel, right? Therefore, I have a fun over here. Okay, Therefore, this is not seen as 2,000 yards together, rather it's seen as 1,000 yards, and therefore it's not a problem. Over here it's 2,000 yards, there's nothing in between it, and therefore Shmuel says, I'm not allowed to carry.
So he's just saying it's a larger rooftop.
No, well he's saying they're both cases of 2,000 yards. They're not going to just argue about the...
That's 2001 as opposed to that's 2000.
And since it's Shmuel consistent, since he holds this is a real wall, that's his opinion in general, even though the 2 walls are flush, we still see it as a virtual wall, therefore the 2,000 yards are split, and therefore it's not a problem. Okay, fine. So, fine. Says the Gemara, V'han mechitza is lamata avidan. Ask the Gemara, even though the walls over here are walls which are made to enclose the area below. In other words, what walls are we talking about? In other words, the real walls are the walls that are meant for the homes beneath. L'malalo avidan. They're not made for above. Okay, and he says, therefore, it's like a karpaf. Okay, it's like a karpov, which is larger than 2 besa, which was not enclosed for residential use. V'chol karpov yotzer besa sayim shelo hukaf l'dira, ein metaltalin bo ela arba. This is still Shmuel speaking. Shmuel basically says, and this, that in a scenario where you have, let's say you have a private residence. If you have a 15-acre home, okay, and that's cool. Okay, let's say you have this large home. Okay, we got to talk. What's it called? But the point is that you have this huge space, okay, and it's enclosed for your house. That's a private domain. But let's say you have a big field which is not enclosed for living in. It's just basically, it's like a farm. It's like enclosed for, it's just your private property, but you don't actually live in that space. That is the karpef. That is this place which is larger than, that's called that's the classic karpef that we've talked about way back when, which is not enclosed for residential use. And if it's larger than about 2,000 yards, then you're not allowed to carry. Okay, so here he's saying the walls, where there are walls over here, but the walls are really walls that are meant for beneath, right? Because the walls, we're extending the walls from beneath, right? We're using these halachic virtual walls. The walls at the end of the day were set up for people beneath, right? And therefore the walls, the virtual walls that go above, they were never set up for residential use. And therefore he says it's no different than a karpef. And therefore he says I'm not allowed to carry throughout the whole thing. That is the basic, even though there are walls, but they're not walls that are ever set up for residential use, because the only walls that were set up were the walls beneath, which were for the people living beneath, but the people on the roof, there's no one living on the roof, and therefore it's no different than a large open space which was surrounded, with walls not meant for living space, and therefore you would not be allowed to carry through that whole thing. Rav obviously argues, meaning Rav would say, what would Rav say? Rav would say at the end of the day, the walls that we're talking about are walls that are meant for a house. Right? So we're just extending house walls. It's true. The area on top is not residential use, but the walls beneath are meant for residential use, and therefore we're just going to extend them higher, and that's why Rav would say it's going to be okay. Okay? One more halacha, which does come up, okay, and that is, if who was just telling us they're going to cruise? Someone had share last night. There we go. Okay, so what is the halacha? What is the halacha? I'm not going to say it on recording. Okay, fine. So what is the halacha? Is a cruise ship, okay, so let's say, most ships are going to have walls that are 10 tvachim high, right? But let's say they don't. Let's say you have a boat which was poorly planned, and the biggest safety hazard in the world. So again, it's not so relevant probably, because most of them are going to have presumably high walls, so people are not like falling over, right? That makes sense. But let's say you have a cruise ship or a big boat which does not have walls that are 10 tvachim high, okay? So like this, Itmar, Svina, a ship, okay? And let's say it's a large ship, meaning it's a cruise ship, okay? So, meaning it's 2,000 yards, which is, again, your cruise ship is huge. Rav says you're allowed to carry throughout the entire thing. Shmuel says, no, you're only allowed to walk 4 amos on such a ship, okay? Meaning, why? Rav says you're allowed to carry through the entire ship because there are valid walls holding the ship together. Okay, Shmuel Amar, you're only going to walk 4 amos. Why? Okay, you know what? I take that back. I think Shmuel is going to say his halacha. I'm sorry. Shmuel would say his halacha that the walls that are made in the cruise ship, even though they may be above 10 tvachim, but he says, what is the function of the wall? It's not, the focus is not to enclose people, it's to block the water. Now, again, we could debate that point, but it seems like no one's arguing about that point, and they're all saying that the walls of the ship were meant, why do you build walls of a ship? So that your deck is not covered with water, right? That's the main function, and therefore you can't treat it as a regular wall, and Shmuel would say, therefore, on like a cruise ship or whatever it is, you would not be allowed to walk around. You're not be allowed to walk around. Why? Because the walls are meant to keep the water out, but not to actually enclose the people inside, okay? Now, fascinating, so now the Gemara concludes, Amalei Rav Chia bar Yosef Shmuel, Rav Chia bar Yosef says to Shmuel, Hilchasa kavasach, does the halacha follow you? Oh, Hilchasa karav, do we follow the halacha like Rav? Amalei Shmuel says, Hilchasa karav. Fascinating. He says, yes, it's true. I hold that really you should not be allowed to carry more than 4 amos, but don't worry, the halacha is like Rav, and therefore if you go on a cruise ship on Shabbos, you'd be, even though Shmuel would say you're not allowed to carry more than 4 amos, Rav would say you're allowed to. Now, do you make an Eruv on your cruise ship? It's like a hotel. Very good, right? So what Poskim would say, it's like a hotel, and since it's like a hotel, that the person you don't bring your own furniture on the cruise ship, and there's furniture that's already there. It's no different than a hotel, and therefore you have walls and you have one owner. Not in quotations. You really have one owner. And how do we define ownership? Because there's furniture in each room defining the owner, and therefore even though you're renting space, the bottom line is you would not need an Eruv, and you could carry on your cruise ship. Have a great day and good Shabbos.